to allow you to access data on behalf of a user. And it's very important, becoming increasingly important for integrations. So I'm going to talk about some work that I've done to allow you to connect to OAuth services easily. Just firstly, to introduce myself. I've been at Alfresco for a little while now. It was first brought out and building extensions like Dashlets. We've got around 40 or so add-ons on the Share Extras project, as Jeff Potts mentioned earlier, and that's been growing steadily over that time since the project was founded in 2010 there. I myself moved over to the engineering team to work specifically on integrations around 1 year ago. So this is an area that I've been working in a lot over the last 12 months or so. So hopefully I can share some of what I've learned here. So the first thing is that integrations are important to Alfresco. They're important as illustrated by this diagram here. Now this is a Forrester diagram, and it's to do with the consumerization of IT, and they picked out about 4 trends back in 2010, I think this diagram is from, and this specifically is to do with integrating organizations into a richer, a bigger ecosystem of services, of partners that today organizations need to work with and need to engage with. So this is showing that the previous hard IT boundaries that existed around organizations, they don't really exist anymore. Those boundaries are porous. People engage with people outside of the organization, with other communities. Information workers are working with different devices, with different cloud-enabled services. So this is a subject that's really close to my heart, and I think that's becoming increasingly important in the future because of these bigger trends that are going on in the IT industry. Now, that requires that we are able to build these services together to create richer environments for our users. Now, this is something that's always been done, but previously integrating 2 different products together in IT was hard, really hard. There were a lot less standards around. We had a lot less in terms of mature processes in engineering circles. Projects relied more on waterfall models for development. Took a long time to get new releases of software products out. Also, the technologies we were working with, things like XML, great technology, was one of the first technologies to allow some sort of standards-based and plain text communication between applications, but still a bit of a pain to parse. XML formats were proprietary, and that led to various difficulties. XML schemas needed to be agreed between applications, so that was done using WSDL and SOAP in service-oriented architecture type arrangements. And even when you've done all of that, when you've built your prototype and you've got the basic communication working between your 2 software products, well, you've then got to probably put some sort of authentication process in place. How do you identify this user that's connecting in from this other application? So authentication is also a big problem. Now today, things are a lot better. I'll put a question mark at the end of that first point because I don't think developers are ever really happy. We always believe, maybe we're just optimists, we think that things can be better. But things are certainly a lot better now than they were in the previous slide. We've got RESTful APIs for a wide range of cloud-based APIs. They expose JSON, which is much easier to parse than XML, much lighter weight, and much more friendly to mobile devices and client-side technologies like web browsers. So we're able to take advantage of some of the more powerful capabilities that exist in clients today because of what's changed under the covers there, because of the changes in these APIs as things have matured. So we're a lot better now. Now the question remains, where does that leave us with authentication? So this is where OAuth comes in. I'm going to talk a bit more about OAuth in the next slide, but let's just talk about this at a general level. So the general way that you might identify yourself if you're connecting to a third-party API provider, let's say you've done a project that integrates Alfresco to Facebook. So you're an Alfresco programmer, you need to connect to Facebook. Well, how do you do that on behalf of the user? Now, initially, you might take a user's username and password. That's not necessarily a good thing. Providers don't tend to like that because it opens up the possibility that usernames and passwords will be compromised, and that could lead to attacks on their site, some general bad PR. So that's not necessarily good. As well as the ability to compromise details when they're shared with these providers, you may run into problems with passwords being changed. They're not always secure, so some people might choose the word password as their password if the provider isn't very good at enforcing minimum password lengths and complexity requirements. So usernames and passwords really isn't a great way of connecting back to an original application. What's really needed is some delegated way of allowing someone to connect to Facebook, say, through Alfresco, but on behalf of that user. So there's these three entities here. You've got your provider, you've got the system, in this case Alfresco, and then you've got the user involved there. And we need to see that user context in both of those locations. So a solution to this is to use tokens. So a token is usually some long alphanumeric value. It's hard to guess, so you wouldn't be able to brute force it normally. It's normally about 20 characters or so. It'll be alphanumeric characters, so pretty hard to brute force. Users aren't going to randomly change their tokens as well. If a token is allocated to you as a user, that token will stay the same until it's expired or revoked by the user. And both of those are behaviors that we can detect and look for and take action on the user's behalf there if that token needs renewing. So tokens are a much better way than usernames and passwords of authenticating the user to these third-party providers. So the exact standard that we use here to grant these tokens and to store them on behalf of the user and to manage those, that standard is OAuth. Now there's actually two varieties of OAuth, I'll come to that in a second, but this is the description from OAuth.net, and OAuth.net is the federation, the group of identity providers that have come together to define this standard that allows you to delegate authorization to a remote provider somewhere else. So we have two variants of OAuth. We have OAuth 1.0 and OAuth 2.0. And in a way, they should be called something completely different because they're actually very different under the covers. The thing they share is that they both use tokens to identify the user. So the user is granted a token, and that token can be used uniquely to identify that user like a username and password would be in a traditional sense. But really, apart from that, they're quite different. So I'm going to go into some details of that and show you how they work. If you do a search for OAuth 2 versus OAuth 1, you'll actually find a lot of stuff on the web. When OAuth 2 was brought in, it was actually very controversial, and it went through a large number of drafts before the standard was finally published around a year ago now. So if you're interested in the background, there's a lot of interesting background there around OAuth 1 versus OAuth 2, which one's better. There's been long flame wars on the web, which is entertaining. I'm going to stay out of that in this talk, but you might be interested in it as background info. So this is OAuth 1.0. This is a diagram from OAuth.net. And obviously, it's a little, I'm not sure how easy that is to read at the back, but you can follow along on the slides that are online if you can't see that fully on the projector. I won't go through all the parameters there, but what I do want to show is the flow here. So on the left-hand side, you've got the consumer. So the consumer, in this case, is something like Alfresco. So Alfresco, I used the example of Alfresco and Facebook earlier. So Alfresco would be on the left-hand side there as that consumer, and Facebook is the service provider on the right-hand side. So the user is driving this flow here because they want to connect Alfresco to Facebook. So they want Alfresco to be able to access Facebook on the user's behalf to pull through data. So the first thing the flow does is Alfresco says, I want to request a token on behalf of this user. The service provider says, yep, you can request a token. I'm going to grant that request and then give you this unique ID that allows you to make that request. So the application grabs that. We're then on that second line there, and where B and C are, if you can read that. The application then directs the user off to the website. So they'll go off to Facebook. On the URL, if you look on the URL, will be that temporary grant token that was originally granted to Alfresco. The user will see a screen. They're prompted to say, do you want to allow Alfresco to access your Facebook account? And you'll normally see a list of scopes or things that the application can do on behalf of the user. Hopefully the user will say yes. They'll then come back to the Alfresco application. And when that happens, the Alfresco application gets another unique code. And that unique code allows the application to then request an access token from Facebook. Facebook then grants this access token, and then Alfresco is responsible for storing that access token somewhere and using that in order to access APIs on behalf of the user. So there's a little bit involved there. On the right-hand side, this actually shows the parameters that are sent backwards and forwards, and a lot of these parameters here, they're really to help keep things secure there. So there's secrets, there's clients, you've got a client key, you've got a client secret, and then the user is granted a token, an access token, and also a secret to go along with that, which should be kept secure. So there's a lot of parameters here. It's actually quite complex. OAuth 2, in comparison, has a few less steps. So here, we've got, again, Alfresco on the left-hand side and, say, Facebook on the right-hand side. Here, we have a couple of less steps. So, again, we must request an access token from the provider, but we actually do that straight away just by sending the person to that provider in their web browser. They're then redirected back to the application again, and then again they get this temporary value. They can use that to go off and grab an access token in step 4, and then they can create connections using that access token again. So it's similar, but actually a lot more straightforward there to implement. This is some more detail on how they're similar and how they differ. So I mentioned there's no grant token up front within OAuth 2. Also in OAuth 2, there's no secret token that's allocated to the user when they get that token back again. There's just this one long value that effectively replaces both the username and the password when you're authenticating as the user there. With OAuth 2, SSL is assumed. It's assumed that you will be using SSL to make these connections out to the provider. So there's really no need to have these secrets in there. And we assume that just the connections between the user and the service provider and between Alfresco and the service provider will be secure, and they'll be secured by SSL, and they won't go over HTTP, basically. And the last major difference is that this is actually quite significant, in that OAuth 2 tokens, once they're allocated to the user, they'll last for a certain while, and then they'll run out. When they run out, we need to renew them. So there is another notion that is that of a refresh token, and that's a longer-lived value that can be used to go to the service provider and says, yep, okay, I know the access token that you granted to the user has expired, and now I want to request a new one. So we have these two types of tokens here. We have an access token and a refresh token in OAuth 2. That's a means of trying to add a bit more security in here. You see with OAuth 1, generally there are more parameters, there's more security, whereas OAuth 2 tends to rely on SSL, but then it did also bring in this notion of refresh tokens to allow the access tokens to expire very quickly. So if your account is compromised, then the user can go and they can revoke the access token and the refresh token, and it means that the application is always having to check back with the service provider, basically to ensure that a security breach hasn't taken place. I'm getting. Okay. So we'll try again with new batteries here. So really, that's a summary of the difference between the two. You're very welcome to go off and read more info. But just to understand that they are quite different implementations. And they're really coming from different backgrounds, these two standards here. So what do we want to do with OAuth? Let's just step back for a minute. I think really this is the ideal scenario here. So we're developers, we want to write code. That code wants to access an API. I've been using Facebook in my examples so far, but there's a wealth of other providers like these three on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, you've got your code. In Alfresco terms, this is probably something that's running on the client side. It could be one of the new widgets that's been built using the new framework. It could be one of the older extension points that we have, like Dashlet, admin console utilities, document library actions. But we're probably writing some client-side JavaScript, and we want that to be able to easily go off and access this remote API. And that's all we want to do. So this is where Share OAuth comes in, and that's really the subject of this talk. We want to be able to easily access these APIs, basically as if they were part of Alfresco, just as easily as we can access the Alfresco repository. And that's pretty easy from a Dashlet. It's pretty easy to fire off an AJAX request that goes off and loads some data from the repository. We want to do exactly the same thing here. So this is what Share OAuth allows. Now, there's a few questions we have to answer here. Share uses this notion of endpoints, and it uses what are called connectors in order to access those. I'll go into some detail of those on the moment, but these are things that the developer is going to have to declare up front. They're going to have to declare what Twitter is, basically what's the host name and path of the URLs that should be used to connect to the API. That's the endpoint. The connector is then the means by which that resource is gone off and fetched. So we have these connectors and these endpoints. Client IDs and secrets are associated with your application. So when you register your application, which would be Alfresco, say, with Facebook, they will give you this client ID and secret as a means to identify Alfresco in general. So not just to represent the user, but we also have these tokens that are per application. So we need to configure those somewhere within the application, all those values. The OAuth dance is basically that flow that I showed you a couple of slides ago. We saw that was different between OAuth 1 and OAuth 2, but the OAuth dance is the word that's used to describe that, because it can be quite complex and difficult to get right. I'm not very good at dancing. Then once we've got that token, when we've completed the flow, we need to store those tokens somewhere I mentioned at the end. So where do we do that? Well, we've got the Alfresco repository to do that. So we've got a nice set of capabilities for that, but how do we actually do that? OAuth 1, we need to sign the requests as well. So before they go out to the service provider, they need to be signed in order to ensure that they're secure, because we might not be operating over HTTPS, so we need to do that. And in general, this whole system needs to be secure. So we don't want to be opening up holes within the Alfresco application that might allow an attacker to compromise user accounts there. So these are some of the things that were key themes in the development of Share OAuth. Now, I mentioned these connectors and endpoints, and I just want to go into a little bit more detail around that so we understand that background and we understand what we need to configure here to allow Alfresco to go off and connect to these. So as I mentioned, the endpoint is really just a base URL for the API, and the connector is a bit of Java code. It actually lives in the surf layer, in the Spring Surf, and it allows you to go off and retrieve a resource from a RESTful endpoint. Each endpoint identifies which connector it should use by referencing the class name of the connector directly. And in addition to these endpoints and connectors, we also have this notion of authenticators. And authenticators are basically responsible for dealing with 401s. So 401 is HTTP status code, meaning not authorized. It means not authorized, please do something and come back to me again once you've really worked out who you are, because I don't know who you are right now. So we also have this notion of authenticating connectors, which use these authenticators. So if we get a 401 back to the Alfresco repository, we know that we probably need to go off and get the user's username and password and then go back to the repository and try again. Maybe the token's expired that we've got open with the repository, who knows? I've got a little diagram that illustrates that. So an endpoint is associated with a connector. You also have these authenticating connectors, which basically wrap a connector, and they use a credentials store in order to store, perhaps there might be a username and password value on behalf of the user, or in our case, a token value that identifies the user. So we have this store that does that. So these concepts are really what we're dealing with when we're talking about extending surf to support these OAuth connections. This is how, if you've looked at the Alfresco configuration, this is one of the config files here. This is how these endpoints and connectors are actually used internally within Alfresco to access the repository. So we have at the top there, you can see this connector. It's called Alfresco. It identifies the ID, the name. It assigns a description, and it identifies the class, the Java class that implements the behavior there. So that Alfresco connector class allows you to go off to Alfresco and retrieve a RESTful resource there. We have an authenticator there. I mentioned authenticators. They work using Alfresco tickets. So if your ticket expires in the repository, it's capable of requesting another one and then appending that ticket parameter to the end of the URL when it goes off and gets that resource on behalf of the user. We have an endpoint. In fact, we actually have a couple of endpoints. I won't go into the difference between the two, but they're allowing you to access the repository. And what's important there is they have the URL of the Alfresco repository in there. So if you run Alfresco on a different host and port, you'll need to override that URL there. So that's how in core Alfresco, we're using these same concepts to connect back to the Alfresco repository. So we want to do exactly the same with RESTful resources in Share OAuth. And this is how we initially did it. So this shows the components here. On the top there, you have client-side code. And let's just say we've done a Dashlet here. So initially we defined a helper class, also in client-side JavaScript. The Dashlet could instantiate one of those in your client-side JS, and that helper class is then responsible for going off and doing a few things. In the layer below that, we have a connector. So we saw connectors in the last bit of configuration. So we declare a custom connector that appends the ticket values, the token values to the URL, hopefully. Also in that web tier in Share, we have a return web script. So remember I talked about the user being granted a token. That requires them to go off to the service provider's website, say, yes, I want to grant Alfresco access to my APIs. And the application redirects them then back to Alfresco. On the end of the URL, there will be this token value. So this return web script is sitting sitting as part of the Alfresco Share application there in that middle tier, and it's responsible for persisting for that token value. So it'll take it off the URL and it'll do something with it. Then we've got the repository model underneath that. There's a custom model that we've got that actually extends the person object in the Alfresco repository. And that allows us to store token values against the person object. And we've got some web scripts that provide an interface to that from Alfresco Share. So we've got a few things going on. And we've got an arrow there to show it's the connector that's responsible for going between Alfresco and the service provider itself. So that's just some more detail. If you're interested in how the data is stored against the CM person object, it's really done by the web scripts, and that's what they're doing. There's some detail of how the return web scripts works, and as I said, this exists in the Share tier, so this isn't a repository tier web script, but it does go down to the repository in order to store that value once it's taken it off the URL. And then it'll redirect the user back to the page they were on before in Share, before they started the token process. Okay, and a little bit more detail about the connector. So this is how the request works. The Dashlet, before it makes a request to the OAuth provider, is responsible for loading the token that was hopefully stored the last time against their CM person object. So they use those token web scripts that are in the repository to load that data. When the token is found, we can then make a HTTP connection out to the provider through our custom connector, and Serve has this proxy servlet that allows us to do that. We get around cross-domain issues by going through the Share proxy there. So if the token's found, then we can go off and make this request. If there isn't a token found, we need to prompt the user to go off and authorize Alfresco and get a token. So we need to display that. Assuming that we have been able to go out and get an API response then, we need to do something with that response. We look at the status code of that response. If that's a 200, it's probably got some data in it which we can display in our Dashlet. If it returns a 401, that means they're not authorized, perhaps their token's expired. Again, we need to display a prompt to the user to do something about that, because we probably can't do much about it ourselves here. So that's how a Dashlet would actually work and go out to the remote API there. This can get quite complex. So we've got the client-side layer going back to the repository initially to load the token data. We've got this OAuth connector that's going off to the service provider that loads tokens from the repository. We've got this return web script which needs to store tokens when it gets them. So there's a few arrows going around the place here. This isn't a great way of architecting the application. It worked initially. We got some good results, and we put out a set of dashlets using OAuth 1 as the mechanism here, based upon this model. So we implemented dashlets for Twitter, for Flickr, for Yammer, and a couple of others there, all using OAuth 1.0. I came back to this about a year ago after I joined the integrations team. I looked at how we could simplify that previous architecture and really make this a lot better in terms of the data flows and improve the security of it as well. So if you notice here, the helper class on the client side has actually gone away. That's no longer there. We've got this connector again on the right-hand side. We still have this connector here. But this connector, it's not going directly to the web script. It's actually using this credential store that's in the middle there to access the tokens. So I talked about the credential stores in one of the first slides. So it's actually using one of those. The return web scripts, when the user gets directed back to Alfresco, we need to store the access token that they've been given, and we also use the credential store for that. So we have some nice data flows within that web tier layer. Then on the repository side, all we have is this credential store web script. We've got rid of our custom model, so we've cleaned that up a lot as well. And because this is now a lot simpler, we don't need this client-side helper. So the Dashlet code is able to just make a request straight away to this connector. There's no upfront loading of the tokens required because the connector actually handles that itself. It knows about the user. It looks the repository into the credential store. Is there a token there? And if so, it'll use that. If there isn't a token, it essentially fakes a 401 to the user. It hasn't passed on the remote request to the service provider. It just returns a 401 straight away. So in our Dashlet, I'll just come back to that. In our Dashlet, I'll just show this flow here. This means that all we now need to do is just make that request. There's no upfront loading of the tokens there. If the request is successful, we display the data. If it's not, i.e. we get a 401, we display the connect action. So our client-side implementation is a lot simpler there. Okay. Okay. So let's just talk about each of those components that we saw on the new architecture diagram. So on this one. So let's just start off at the bottom in the repository tier. I mentioned that we've got rid of the custom model, and that's because we are using this credentials store. The credentials store was added in Alfresco 4.1, and that was added in for another project I worked on, which was Google Docs. So we needed a way to securely store OAuth tokens for a user. The storage mechanism is similar to the proprietary mechanism that was used by the original Share OAuth, but it's storing these items again on the person objects. So that's fairly similar, and it means we could get rid of that custom model. We did need to implement a couple of web scripts. There weren't actually web scripts around that to wrap those services and expose them to the other tiers. And the reason for that was the Google Docs implementation used entirely repository layer services. So it was accessing this new credential store directly through the repository API. So we added a couple of web scripts there into the repository, but that's all there is now in the repository tier that's custom. In the web tier, as I said, we have this credential store, and that's responsible for loading these values from those custom web scripts. And again, we have the return web scripts there that uses the credential store. I showed the configuration of these connectors and endpoints that is used by Alfresco. This is an example of what you would have to do now as a developer if you want to access, in this case, this is the GitHub API. So this is an example of the connector, the endpoint that you would declare in order to access the GitHub API. So we've got an ID there. we're saying the connector that we want to use. So all these connectors have been declared already. There's another config file I'm not showing here that's provided by Share OAuth. And we're just referencing the connector by ID. This is OAuth 2 query string. You can specify a different connector. There's a couple of examples. The query string one just appends the user's access token as a parameter on the URL when it makes the request to the service provider. And there's another one that uses the authorization header to send the token value over. Different providers require one or both, so you can flick between those two depending on the OAuth 2 provider here. So this stuff is all OAuth 2. So that's what the configuration would look like if you're a developer and you want to go off and access an API. And that's really all you need. You just declare that, you start writing a client-side JavaScript, and there you go. So we covered that flow. So I want to show some examples now that actually use this. So this should show what you can actually do in terms of going off and accessing these third-party services. I'm just going to switch to this video. Okay. So there's no sound here. Ooh. Give me a second. Okay, let's try that again. Definitely doesn't like full screen. Okay. I think it's because it's not mirroring the screen.
Just push play without mirroring the screen.
Okay. So you can see we're adding a dashlet here. This dashlet is accessing the GitHub API, so it's using that code that we saw in the previous example. So this is a user dashlet. What I'm doing here now in this demo is I'm adding this dashlet to my user dashboard. So as you can see from the description, it's going to load up my user notifications from GitHub. So that's basically my activity feed from GitHub. And it needs to access that as me. First thing I need to do is I need to connect. This takes me off to GitHub within the web page, and it's telling me that Share Extras, this is the application, wants to access this data on my behalf. So I click Allow. I come back to Alfresco. It redirects me back, and it loads the data from GitHub. So it's really as simple as that. The code to implement that is just some JavaScript. So it's a custom dashlet, and there's client-side components there that's defined. And all that does is it makes AJAX requests via this proxy, via the Share proxy, just like we would do if we were accessing the Alfresco repository. We get JSON data back, and we display that in line within the dashlet there. Okay, see if I can show another example here. So this is a similar example using a different OAuth 2 provider. In this case, this is Salesforce. So this is a screenshot of a demo Salesforce account that I've got. I'm going to start off in Salesforce. So this is my user profile here, and you can see my activity feed. So we want to display that activity feed in Share on the user dashboard. So much the same as GitHub. I go into the configure dashboard screen. I drag the dashlet into whichever column I want it in there. Click OK. It comes back. Obviously, I haven't authenticated the user to Salesforce, so it doesn't know who I am, so I need to go through that flow. It says, do you want to allow the Dashlet to do these actions on your behalf? And I click Allow. Again, that redirects me to the application, and I can see those same notifications that I had there in the Dashlet. What I can also do here is I can write a post. So this works for going out to the provider and making post requests to upload data as well. And that appears there in the activity feed. So this is a read-write example. We had a read-only example a minute ago with GitHub. And you'll see if I switch back to Chatter there, back to Salesforce, you see that status that I posted through Share has come through to Salesforce there. So that's really there. Okay. There's one more example I want to show. And this example was mentioned by Florian in his lightning talk yesterday. This is another project that is on Share Extras. So this is the JavaScript console. That's not the JavaScript console. Okay, there we go. Okay. So Florian's also integrated GitHub support in here, and I think this is an interesting example because it's not just displaying stuff in a Dashlet. It's actually using a service like Gist in this case, that's provided by GitHub, to load and store JavaScript snippets or free marker snippets that you might use in the JavaScript console. So for developers, I think this is really powerful. I just want to show some of the capabilities here. So we're logging into to Alfresco here, and we're logging in as admin now. So I was using a test user before, just a normal user. Now I'm logging in as an admin. I access the admin tools there, and I want to select the JavaScript console that's on the left-hand side. So this is always the same as it has been, the JavaScript console. Great application, and increasingly mature now. So we have our JavaScript snippet there. This is actually coming from the repository, and I can load up a number of scripts from the repository that are stored in the data dictionary there. So that's always been there. What is new, in this case, is this next menu down. So I can access GitHub, and I can load these snippets that I've got stored in my account. So I can do that. But what's really interesting is I can access snippets that I've starred in GitHub. So I don't have any there, but what I might want to do is search for some. So I can go off to GitHub, search for Alfresco. You see on the left-hand side, I've got a faceted search there. So I can say I only want to see JavaScript snippets. So I go off. There's quite a few that community members have added on GitHub there. I found this one. That resets a user's dashboard to the default configuration. Oh, that looks interesting. So this is actually by Peter Lufgren. I star that. If you saw that in the UI, I clicked the star button. Then what I need to do is come back into the JavaScript console. From the load scripts menu, I look at my starred gists, and I just hit that button. So that loads that straight away. There's no messing around. Again, the script is there. So I think this is really powerful because it allows how you can use something like OAuth to connect out to a remote service like GitHub and actually really add value to the tools that we've already got in Alfresco and the add-ons that we've already got in Share Extras. There are other implementations, as I mentioned, so these are all using OAuth 1.0, and these are already on Share Extras. We are still developing these. We're still developing Share OAuth. There are a number of things that I'm looking at right now. So I mentioned the two implementations that we have, and OAuth 1.0 is actually still using the previous implementation where you have to load the tokens up front. And the OAuth 2 is using the new architecture where they all got automatically loaded. We don't need to do that in our client-side code, and this client-side helper class has gone away. So there's some work to be done to implement those changes for OAuth 1.0. To deprecate that client-side class that's used, that helper class, because that will no longer be needed, and the dashlets will be simplified a great deal. So there's more information available there on the Share OAuth project site, and you can download the dashlets there and have a look at them. So all the code examples that I mentioned, the Chatter Dashlet, the GitHub Dashlet, they're all available on Share Extras, and of course Share OAuth itself. Okay, so I think we have a couple of minutes for any questions. Okay, well, I am doing a talk in the room next door in H1 in about 10 minutes, so I'll be running off just right there in a second, but you can come and talk to me at the end of that session or after the sessions around the experts area. I'll be hanging around there. So if you've got any thoughts on this, you want to know any more, then please do come and find me. I hope you got something useful out of the talk. Thank you.